Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. This is the fifth in a series of webinars that we put together specifically for the various urban programs around the country. Some of these webinars are designed to be particular interest to executive directors. Some are more geared towards board members, but everyone is welcome to participate in any one of them. And what we've been doing is to kind of cover a broad range of nonprofit governance and management topics. And so today's is one aspect of nonprofit governance, which is conflicts of interest. And I know from my experience working with many of the urban programs that conflicts of interest are something that you have to deal with quite often. And there's something that really are really important to pay attention to if you're going to be effective stewards for your organizations. So I think it's a particularly important and timely topic for us today. And before I go any further, I just want to remind folks of a couple of things. One is if you have any trouble hearing me or any technical problems or any questions, you could type them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to kind of get on top of them. So it's time that we just kick this off, and so here we'll go. So the goal for today is really to kind of get a better understanding of conflicts of interest, what they are, how do you deal with them, how they might affect your organization. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish. Those are the big broad goals right there. Our objective is really to define a conflict of interest. So what is it specifically that we're talking about? We want to all be on the same page with a common definition and a common understanding of what a conflict of interest is. We'll explore the different kinds of conflicts of interest that your agency may experience and their implications as well. We'll really look at why it matters that you pay attention to conflicts of interest, because they have far-reaching implications, some positive, some not so positive. So we'll look at the different kinds you may have. We'll look at conflict of interest in terms of their expectations, and what are your expectations of people who may be in situations where there are conflicts of interest. So, and this is an important point because very often conflicts of interest are unavoidable. In that case, we really have to be clear about what we expect of people who may be in those conflicted relationships. We'll look at the elements of a conflict of interest and disclosure statements. So kind of a clear set of expectations. If somebody is in a conflict of interest, what is it that you expect of them as a board member, as a staff person, as a volunteer? So those are our objectives. That's what we're hoping to accomplish on this webinar. And we laid out the agenda in such a way, we did the welcome and introductions. A quick overview, we're looking at all different kinds of conflicts of interest. Really want to make sure that we tailor this webinar to the kinds of conflicts of interest that might be more relevant to your organizations. We'll also discuss the whole notion of perceptions versus reality. Many people believe that a perception of conflict is the same thing as the reality of one. So we can talk about that as well. We'll look at areas where conflicts may arise. We'll look then at the nature of conflicts of interest. Take some time to look at the elements of conflict of interest policy and disclosure policy. So give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to make sure you have in place if you don't currently. And if you have good conflict of interest and disclosure policies in place, it might be helpful, might be something to look at to fine-tune those to make sure that they really are up to speed. And then we'll evaluate the session. At the end of the webinar, or sometime shortly thereafter, you'll get an email with a link to an evaluation. And I would invite you all to please respond to that and give us your honest feedback about how this webinar was for you. Any kind of feedback you can give us will help us to improve the way we're providing this kind of training to the NCOI members around the country. So please make sure that you do take a few minutes and do that evaluation. I also want to invite you to reflect on a couple of questions. And these are questions that I'm going to put up on the screen now, and I'll put them up again in a little while. I'd like you to reflect on these questions, perhaps make some notes to yourself, type some comments or thoughts into the chat box, but I'd really like to hear from you all about these particular questions. One would be to kind of share with everyone on this webinar What are some of the conflicts of interest that arise that you think may be unique to the urban Indian health programs? How does your organization handle conflicts of interest? It would be helpful for us to learn from each other. So how do you, in your particular program, handle conflicts of interest? And the third discussion question, can conflicts of interest be managed in a way that safeguards the organization? If you could think of a good example in your particular agency where you're working with a conflict of interest and you're managing it in a way that might be helpful for other people to learn. So this notion of these three discussion questions is really about mutual learning here and mutual sharing, so we can kind of learn from each other. Again, reflect on these questions if you will, make some notes to yourself or type some comments in the chat box, and we'll come back to these questions in a very short time. In the larger context of things, it's important to keep in mind that as a board member, you have two major kind of responsibilities. One of those is around stewardship. So you, as a good steward of your organization, are charged with making sure that you protect the assets of your organization. And your assets are not just the money you have in your bank, but the assets are property. Your assets are things like your reputation in the community. These are the things that as good stewards you are responsible for protecting. And under stewardship as well, the notion of having a sustainable organization. So in terms of your responsibility as governors or as trustees, stewardship is a big part of what you do. And the other big part is mission alignment. You are really responsible to make sure that all of your activities are consistent with your mission and your core values. So that's the kind of larger context when we talk about conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest and how you manage them is about good stewardship. It's about protecting your assets. And mission alignment, conflict of interest, when you have to manage them to make sure you have clear expectations, good disclosure statements and expectations around disclosure to make sure that your conflict of interest policies are aligned with your mission. So that's how those things fit into the ultimate responsibility of board members. For every human being, we all are people. We're all human. We're only human. Many people are in situations where they may have their own motivations. They may have multiple loyalties. A good example I always share with people around multiple loyalties would be the two U.S. senators from my state. There are two state senators from Maine. They spend most of their time in Washington, D.C., and they have multiple loyalties. They have loyalties to their constituents in the state of Maine, but they also have loyalty to everyone in the country. And so they have the balance of those two things. What is in the best interest of the people in my state, and what's in the best interest of our country as a whole? So that's an example of having multiple loyalties. And I wanted to put this slide up to just kind of point out that we are all just human, and we're trying to do our best to manage situations that may be conflicted, where we really want to make sure that we're very careful and prudent in how we manage them so that we can protect our organization. In the context of your legal obligations as a board member and as boards of directors, there are the three duties we have: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And when we talk about conflicts of interest and how to manage them and how to avoid them, we're really talking about your duty of loyalty. And this, again, is your loyalty to your organization and your ability as a trustee to put the best interest of the organization and the people you serve above anything personal or professional. So this is the real large context for the discussion around conflicts of interest. It's about how do I honor this duty of being loyal, even when there may be multiple loyalties. So that's the kind of bigger picture. I thought we might look at some definitions quickly of a conflict of interest. It exists when there's a board member, an officer, or management employee who has a personal interest that's in conflict or could be in conflict with the interests of the organization, such that he or she may be influenced by this personal interest when making decisions for the organization. So a conflict of interest is when your personal interest and the best interest of the organization may not quite be in sync. And it's important that establishing policy and processes for dealing with these conflicts and these potential conflicts of interest. Here's a more common and simpler definition, I think. Conflict of interest, it means a conflict or an appearance of a conflict between private interest and official responsibilities of a person in a position of trust. And that's who you are. Remember, you're a trustee. That means you are entrusted with somebody else's money to advance your mission and to use that money in a way that's prudent and aligned with your mission and your strategies. So that's a common definition. And one of the we'll talk about in a little while will be, how do I know what a conflict of interest is, or whether I might be in a conflict of interest? And I'll share with you some ways in which we can think about that. When you think about conflicts in terms of what the Internal Revenue Service, I thought this would be helpful. The Internal Revenue Service, because you're a 501c3 nonprofit, you're prohibited from transferring any money or property to insiders, and that's a term they call private inurement. You don't have to worry about the legalities of some of these terms, but some examples. If you're paying an executive an excessive compensation, you are literally transferring money to somebody on the inside. If you're overpaying for goods and services, it's the same thing. You are in a sense not spending the resources you have in a way that's prudent. Tax-exempt organizations are created to serve charitable purposes, so they're not there to benefit any individual. So if you look at IRS regulations and the legal aspects of all this, you'll see terms like private inurement or private benefit. The simple way to think about it is that everything you do as a board has to be done in a way that's in the best interest of the organization first and foremost. When I think of conflicts of interest, another way to consider them is that there's some things that are just totally unacceptable. Some things that may be illegal or widely regarded as unethical. So that's on one end of the continuum. The other end of the continuum are some conflicts of interest where there may not be any appreciable consequence. So sometimes there's conflicts of interest where they're really not appreciable. It's nothing to worry about. What's important is that you take a look and make sure that you arrive at that conclusion after a thoughtful and deliberative process. So again, thinking about conflicts of interest, you think about them in legal terms and think about them in terms of one end of a continuum being it's absolutely wrong, to the other end where it doesn't matter that much. And the areas that we'll focus on during this webinar are those areas kind of in the middle, the kind of gray area. We're not quite sure whether this is something we should do something about or not, and if it is something we should do something about, what is that something? I thought it might be helpful to ponder this question as well. Is there really a difference between a conflict of interest and a perceived conflict of interest? Does it really matter? Many people will say there's no difference. Many people will say if the situation is perceived as being conflicted, then for all intent and purposes, it really is. And I believe that for the most part. So when we're looking at it, at a conflict of interest situation, it's not just a matter of making sure that there's a full disclosure, for example. It's making sure that this perception is not going to affect my organization in a negative way. So here are 4 tests for determining whether you have a conflict of interest. And I'll go in depth on these in a few minutes. But one is the peer standards test. By implication, you look at your peers, and if it passes muster with them, then you know it's not a conflict of interest, or that it is. The smell test. I think you may be familiar with this one. If something doesn't smell right, something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. There's a reasonable person test. You simply ask the question, would a reasonable person judge this to be a conflict of interest? And then the best interest test, which is the 4th test. Is this situation in the best interest of my organization? So what I'll do in the next few slides is to go through these 4 in a little more depth and as tools that you might use when you're looking at a conflict of interest situation or trying to determine whether one exists. So the peer standards test is the first one. Peer standards test is simply, it asks the question, would this behavior relationship in question is commonly acceptable within a given sector? So would the community accept and approve of this person or organization's behavior? It's simply saying, would the people in this community, knowing about this, be okay with it or not? So you're looking to your peers in that sense. So that's the peer standards test. There's the smell test. With this test, the question is, how might key stakeholders, the public or the media, react to this activity if it were publicly disclosed? And what impact would this activity have on the credibility of the organization and its leadership? So this is one of those questions where it's important to point out, and in fact, I worked with a board chairperson once who said, no matter what we do, if it makes the headlines in tomorrow's newspaper, I want to feel good about it. So when you think about this, if you're in a situation that you think is a conflict of interest, if it were made public, would that have a negative effect on your organization? And again, part of this, the way I think about this test is kind of a matter of that kind of gut feeling about something. The third test is the reasonable person test. So with this test, the question is, what would a reasonably prudent person or a board do under these circumstances? And this is really important because it really gets at the duty of care that I talked about in a slide earlier on. And you want to be in a position where you're exercising the same degree of care and diligence and skill that a reasonably prudent person would show in comparable circumstances. Again, this is something that, when I think about this, I think about kind of common sense. What would a reasonable person think about this particular situation, whatever the situation may be? So that's the third test. And the fourth and final test is the best interest test. And this best interest test is about your responsibility as a board member to act honestly and in good faith when you're making decisions on behalf of the organization. And this goes back again to that duty of loyalty that I talked about in that earlier slide. And sometimes board members do feel torn between their loyalties, between a particular constituency and a nonprofit organization. You may feel torn sometimes in your position as a board member as well. And I, again, want to invite you, as you think about those discussion questions, to please share some of those experiences with your fellow board members on this webinar. The best interest test. When the hour decision arrived, it's the board's members' responsibility to cast a vote by determining the best interest of the organization, regardless of the impact on his or her constituents. And again, I think this goes to the example I used earlier with our state senators. One of my state senators, as an example, was involved in a lot of the base closings around the country about 6 or 7 years ago. And she had to make some decisions about which bases, military bases, to close. And she had to make a decision about closing one in Maine. So here she was with a kind of split loyalties. She wanted to act in the best interest of Maine and the people in Maine, and at the same time to act in the best interest of the country, in which case the country was saying we need to reduce some of our military bases. So again, she had to make that decision based on the best interest of the organization, in her case for the United States. If a director can't make the decision, then they're obligated to really declare that there is a conflict of interest and abstain from the discussion as well as voting. So there's kind of a balance here. And I think one of the guiding principles in all of this, and it's the one thing to take away from this whole webinar, if you're in your boardroom and an issue comes up and you think it might be a conflict of interest, it's simply a matter of saying, is this a conflict of interest? Let's explore it. Let's look honestly and determine whether it is or not. And if we determine that it is a conflict, what could or should we do about it? So those are the 4 tests. I want to come back to the discussion question, and I want to take a minute and just kind of invite you to kind of share some of your thoughts or comments in response to these questions. So anyone, please feel free to kind of type something in that chat box. Don't worry about typos and anything else. Just make it something that we can understand. Um, what are some areas where conflicts really are unique to urban Indian health programs would be one of those questions, if you know of any. How does your particular organization handle conflicts of interest? So, for example, do you have a conflict of interest policy? What are the key points in that conflict of interest policy? And the third question, if you're in a situation where you have a conflict of interest and there's no way you can get around that, what are some ways you might be managing that conflict of interest? So these are questions for you to ponder and respond to, and I'll give you a minute or two to just kind of think about that. And please feel free to type something in that chat box if you would. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any comments at this point, so please, the invitation continues. It's wide open, or if you have a question, please type it in the chat box on your computer screen, and I will move on, and we'll talk a little bit about why this might matter. They affect your organization's credibility. That's one reason why they matter. They affect your organization's reputation. Again, when I talked earlier about your responsibility as being good stewards for your organization to look out for your assets and to protect those assets. And your reputation is an incredibly important asset. And when something happens that affects it in a negative way, it's very difficult to come back and undo. I see something in the chat box. I want to just look at it quick. Would attempting to set up a work position to benefit an organization but also benefit the person be a classic conflict? Okay, so that's a question I'll come back to in a minute. I'll finish this slide. Why do conflicts of interest matter? Because they erode trust and confidence in your organization on the part of funders, partner organizations, clients, donors, the community. You want to always be building and inspiring confidence in your organization, so people will, so you will have clients who will come and benefit from the services, and trust. You'll want to have funders who have confidence that you're doing the work well, that you're managing things well, that you're paying attention, crossing your T's, dotting your I's. Let me look at the question again, and I'll read it back out because I'm not sure if everyone can see the question. Would attempting to set up a work position to benefit an organization but also benefit the board person be a classic conflict? And that sounds to me like there is a conflict in there, and it would be worthwhile for whoever wrote this to kind of, in a very transparent way, trying to sort out with your board, how is this a conflict? What might be the implications if we go forward on this or not? And if we do this and we see it as a conflict, is there a way to have a full disclosure about it so we have it out there in front of everybody and we are transparent? There's a second question. Many organizations hire relatives of people on the board, or directors will hire relatives, common in the community. That is one of the examples in my mind that I see often in small nonprofits, and I see it a lot with the urban health programs as well. When you hire relatives of somebody who's serving on the board, there's questions about who is directly responsible for a person. The inherent conflict is that when you are a trustee on the board of directors and you have a relative, in a sense, who is below you, who in some ways answers to you, that creates an awkward kind of position. When you bring in multiple relationships, so in this case, our dual relationship where you have somebody who's an employee and also a relative, these are examples of places where there are conflicts of interest and have to be managed. So again, when you think about hiring a relative, a classic example, if you were the chief executive and you were the executive director, could you hire your cousin to be the custodian? Well, you could, but there would clearly be dual roles there, or multiple roles, and there would need to be some absolute open, transparent disclosure in that case. And you would also have to make a case for, is this the best person to take that job? did I explore all the other competent candidates for this position? So again, it's a lot of this is a matter of really paying close attention and honestly asking yourself the difficult questions. A third question: we had a board member whose husband was in a lawsuit against our organization. Due to the transparency of our financials, we did not feel the wife could stay on the board. Was there any way of keeping her? Now, as I understand that question, there's clearly a conflict of interest, and when there's conflicts of interest, people have to do something. So in this case, here is a person whose husband is in a lawsuit against the organization. The person would need to step down off the board in a way to make sure that there's no perception that anything is going on kind of under the table. These are very good questions that folks are raising, and they are, to some extent, kind of specific. Please feel free after this webinar to connect with me at my email address if you would like further discussion or some additional comments. I would be glad to make on some of your questions. I'm trying to respond to them in general ways. If your question is really specific and relevant, particularly to your organization, please feel free to follow up with an email, and I will get back to you for sure within 24 hours. And I hope that that will be another avenue for people to share some of their, to find some support and some resource from this webinar. So thank you for those questions, and please feel free to continue with your questions. Potential conflict areas. And I think what we're going to see here is the questions that you raised will be addressed to some extent when we look at these areas. So potential conflict areas around financial things. Board member derives a financial benefit from providing a service for a fee. Okay, so there's a conflict of interest there. If you're serving on the board and you're providing a service for a fee, those are two very different kind of things and need to be reconciled in some way. Loyalty to more than one organization. If you serve on 2 or more boards with similar missions, you've got to be able to juggle these things, and it's incredibly difficult to do. This is another area where there are potential conflicts of interest. Conflicting roles and relationships. Chief executive serving on the board for which he is accountable. If your chief executive is a board member, then that's an example of where here is a person who works for the board and is also part of that very board. So there is a conflict there that needs to be addressed somehow. Serving on the board and being a patient of a clinic is another place where I think it's important for Urban Indian Health Program board members to be conscious of, that if you're serving on the board of your clinic and you're a patient there, when you go in to get services, it's important to make sure that people see you as a patient, not somebody who's on the board of directors, because that's the kind of thing you don't want to be. You don't want to be treated or appear to be treated special simply because you're on the board. The whole notion of these roles and relationships are really about trying to wear more than one hat at the same time. There are a few more questions. I'll read them out to you, and I'll try to respond as best as I can. And please feel free, if you have any thoughts or comments around any of these questions, to please respond as well in the chat box. Here's question number 4. An area of conflict of interest between a non-profit and a political party that a board member is committed to. Okay, now if you are a board member and you are committed to a political party, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. As a board member, you cannot go out and campaign for a candidate, for example, but as an individual member of a community, as a citizen, you can certainly go out and campaign for people. So it's a potential area for conflict or perceived conflict, and you have to put that out in a way that either get out of that conflict or find a way to have a disclosure about it, so you can be open and honest with everybody who has an interest in your organization. Question number 5. How would one handle a conflict if a board member owns a restaurant and is paid to provide food for an event? That's another good. These questions, by the way, are really excellent questions. And again, I would be glad to follow up in more detail on any of them if you'd like, if you would like. I'll read it again. How would one handle a conflict if a board member owns a restaurant and is paid to provide food for an event? If your organization contracts or hires a restaurant to cater a function, for example, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. If the board member is involved in that, if you have a board member who owns that restaurant, that board member clearly has to disclose that. So everyone on the board needs to know that this board member who is on our board is also the person providing this food, this service. And if that's the case, the board would have to ask questions like, are there other restaurants that we could use for this service? For example, if the person who owns the restaurant, that person may decide that it's too conflicted for them and may choose to not serve on the board any longer. There's no law that says that this is illegal, that somebody on your board who is also providing food because they own a restaurant. It's simply asking the question, is there a conflict of interest? Is the nature of that conflict such that it will harm our organization? Or the perception of it, would that harm our organization? And in some cases, if we stay with the same question, if this was a restaurant that provided food for one function and it was a relatively small thing, it may be one of those conflicts of interest that's in the inconsequential category at the far end of the continuum. You can simply be public about it and disclose it and be fine with it. If it's something where you're spending a lot of money and relative to your budget, and there are lots of other choices for restaurants, then you have to ask the question, will we be perceived as playing favorites here simply because this person is on our board? These questions are excellent questions, and every single one of them has really brought out some of the complexities when you're looking at conflicts of interest. As I said earlier, sometimes this is not black and white. It really gets into some gray areas. Here's some other examples of conflicts of interest. If it was a foundation board member serving on the board and an organization was seeking funds from that foundation, well, there would be those dual roles. That would clearly be a conflict of interest. You'd be making decisions about whether your organization is going to get funds. A second example, if the foundation board member is an employee of an organization seeking a grant. It's another example of where someone is going to benefit, not just the organization, and you have to look at that really closely. Here's a third example, serving as a board member while providing goods and services for a fee. And that's the question we just asked. The dual roles. Role number one, I'm a trustee of this organization. Role number two, I'm a restaurant owner and I'm providing food for a fee. Those are examples of conflicts of interest. Again, whether they rise to a level that they really matter is a question. How might they be perceived by the community is a question. Is there something we should do about this? And if so, what is it? Serving as a board member while your spouse provides goods or services for a fee. And again, you can see that same kind of thing where there could be other people, where it could be perceived as you're doing something with some kind of ulterior motive, that somebody is benefiting in a way that they shouldn't. And again, when you look at these and some of the examples you shared in your question, I would invite you to go back and look at the 4 tests and ask yourself and put those questions to one of those tests and see what you come up with. Again, the tests are designed as a tool to help you sort out whether a situation is a conflict of interest or not. Other areas where you may find conflicts arise, and some of these, supplying goods or services to the agency. So if a person or firm is supplying goods or services, and this is the restaurant example again, if you're paying rent on your property, say your clinic's in a building and you're paying rent and somebody on the board is the landlord, there's a conflict of interest there. Now, how much it matters and in what way it matters, that's up for you and your board to really sort through and to do it in a way that's honest and transparent and in the best interest of your organization. Competing organizations are another place where you find um, areas that could be conflicts. Donors and others supporting XYZ, and XYZ is just a blank for the organization. So you may find when there are donors or others supporting an organization. So an example of this might be you may have somebody on your board who donates a huge amount of money to your organization, and they're on your board. So does that mean they influence decisions? Is there a conflict of interest there, or could there be? What would you expect of that person in terms of disclosure? How would you handle that? How much weight would you give to that person? And a general rule in situations like that is that board members really need to be all on an equal playing field. Everybody shares the power equally. Family members, friends, or other employees. So those are other areas. And again, some of the questions that came up, the questions you all asked, fit this category as well. When you bring friends or relatives into an organization, you automatically have more than one role. You have at least two roles there, and that's got to be sorted through. And when you sort it through, again, go back to looking at those different tests and see how it might pass muster. The nature of conflicting interests. So owning stock or holding debt and or other proprietary interests of the third party dealing with the organization. Holding office, serving on the board, participating in management, or being otherwise employed in any third party dealing. These are all examples of where you can get into trouble. Receiving remuneration for service with respect to individual transactions involving the agency. So if you were a board member and you owned a restaurant, that would fit that category as well. Using the organization's time, personnel, equipment, supplies, or goodwill for purposes other than what the organization is supposed to be doing. This is another area where you have to be very thoughtful. You may have a van, for example, that you use to transport clients. Is the driver of the van allowed to drive the van home at the end of the day and come back in the morning with it? Can the person who's driving the van stop at the grocery store on the way home? Well, if he or she does, that's not the purpose of the van. You have to ask the question, is this a conflict of interest? And then again, if it is it consequential? So if you just stay with that as one simple example, if you have an employee and this person drives your van and that's what he does for his job, and the van is designed simply to transport clients, and the employee uses the van to go back and forth to work, that's not what it's designed to do. So you have to have a clear expectation about under what circumstances can this van be used that may not be directly related to our activities or programs or purposes, and make a decision about whether that's okay with you or not. And there's a big difference between a van which can only be driven for specific stated purposes versus a van that can be driven and the owner can use it to go back and forth to work, versus a van that can be used where the employee can use it anytime he or she wants on the weekend. So I'm kind of, in my example, going out on a continuum to something that starts out very small and inconsequential could become serious as you move along that continuum. Having some protections in place so it's clear what the expectations are is a good way to avoid that. Receiving personal gifts or loans from third parties dealing with your organization. It's never a good idea to accept money from anybody. Nominal gifts that have nominal value you might accept, because to refuse a gift that has nominal value might be something would be perceived as being discourteous or impolite. A simple example when I think of this is if you were a Head Start teacher and the parents of one of your students came in and brought you a birthday cake, would you accept it or not? Well, you probably would. It doesn't have a lot of real financial value, and it would be impolite or discourtesy to not accept it. But if somebody comes in and offers you money for something or a gift, for example, if the parent of that Head Start student came in and gave you a gift that was valuable, you would have to refuse that. Personal gifts of high value or money really should not be accepted. There's too many areas where that can be perceived as really harmful to your organization. Purpose of conflict of interest. Why do we have them? Okay. Well, they provide guidelines, give you a sense of what to do when we're in a situation. So if I think about the 5 questions that folks ask, I would ask each of the folks who asked the questions, do you currently have a conflict of interest policy? And if you do, how does that help you with the question you raised? Perhaps you don't have a conflict of interest policy, you need to create one. It may be that you have one, but it's not sufficient, or it needs to be refined and made better. Ultimately, again, all of this is about protecting the assets of your organization. When you have a good conflict of interest policy, it's a way to ensure that you're doing your best to protect your assets. There's another question I'll read to folks. Is it possible for a board to mistakenly gloss over any perception of a conflict, perhaps in refusing to deal with this conflict of interest because it may create a rift for some board members? That's a good question. I think I will read it one more time because I'm not sure if you all can see the chat or not. Is it possible for a board to mistakenly gloss over any perception of a conflict, perhaps in refusing to deal with this conflict of interest because it may create a rift for some board members? There are times when it's difficult to address an issue that might be a conflict of interest. And we often will feel like, well, we don't want to deal with this because it's going to create a rift. If that's our only reason for not dealing with it, probably not a good reason. Because your job as a trustee is to make sure you deal with things that could affect your organization. So if it was mistakenly glossed over and you come to realize afterwards there may be a conflict, it may be worthwhile to go back and have a conversation about it. Boards have to have difficult conversations sometimes. They can be done in a way that's respectful and honest and direct. So it can be done, and boards do it all the time. You don't want to find yourself not dealing with an issue simply because you're afraid it's going to ruffle some feathers. When you find yourself acting and the motivation is fear, it's probably not the best motivation. So again, I would encourage folks to simply, if it's a difficult conversation, try to kind of find the courage to frame the discussion in a way that's honest and respectful and direct, and do your best to work it out. If it's a major kind of issue, sometimes it helps to bring in a third party to help facilitate or mediate the conversation. Sometimes just having a third party in the room has a positive effect when you have difference of opinion. Here's another question I'll share with you. Is it ever a good idea for board members to choose to vote that a presenting conflict, such as providing food for an event or providing a service, is acknowledged and accepted and or approved? And I'll read that one more time. Is it ever a good idea for board members to choose to vote that a presenting conflict, such as provide food for an event or provide a service, is acknowledged and accepted and or approved? As I understand the question, if you were in a board meeting and it came up that somebody on your board was going to provide food for an event, I believe it would be a good idea to acknowledge that and have that entered into your minutes. In a sense, you're saying, yeah, there is a conflict of interest here. The full board is aware of it, and we're okay to make a decision to do this at this time. That's a way to at least be open and honest and transparent about it. It suggests to me that you may need to kind of go back and look at your conflict of interest policy so that you can avoid situations where conflicts come up that way. That's another excellent question, and I thank you all for these questions. And again, if you would like more in-depth response or something more specific, please feel free to follow up with me with an email. Managing conflicts of interest. Okay, so here's a situation where it's inevitable. You have a conflict of interest. This happens often in smaller communities. You may live and work in a small community where there's only one person who's an accountant, a certified public accountant. If that's the case and that person happens to be related to somebody on your board, then there may not be anything else you can do about that but simply have some kind of disclosure about it, be open and honest about it. Conflicts of interest can happen and they can be managed. It's always best to try to avoid them, but it's sometimes inevitable. Material transaction is fully disclosed in the audited financial statement. So you want to make sure that if you're managing a conflict of interest, especially around money, that it's disclosed when you do your audit. And it's out there, and you're simply saying, we looked at this, we're okay with it. We still believe we're acting in the best interest of our organization. The related parties excluded from discussions and approval of such actions. So it's another way you remove, you manage a conflict of interest. So if, for example, and I'll just stay with it as an example, the restaurant question earlier. If someone on your board owns a restaurant and the board is considering whether to buy food from that restaurant for an event, it would be wise for the board, if the board just decides to act on that, to have a discussion where that person recuses themselves from the discussion and from the decision, so that at least they are not part of the decision. And that kind of creates a little bit of space in terms of managing it. A competitive bid or comparable valuation exists. If you're looking at the restaurant example and there's another restaurant in the community and they can provide the exact same quality for less money, you have to look at whether you should make that choice instead of the choice of your board member. And you have to be able to justify that based on, as an example, one of those 4 tests that I talked about earlier. The board has acted upon and demonstrated that the transaction is in the best interest of the organization. So you're looking at this, you want to make sure you disclose it. You want to make sure that the person involved isn't part of the discussion or decision, that there really is no place else to go of comparable value, and that you're acting in what you believe in your heart and in your head is the best interest of the organization. When in doubt, the board should determine whether a conflict exists and whether it's material. And this is the kind of legal language, but a conflict, whether it exists is one thing, whether it's material, meaning whether it really matters, I guess. In the presence of an existing material conflict, whether the contemplated transaction may be authorized as fair, just, and reasonable. So when you're in doubt, you got to make sure that it's fair, it's just, and it's making sense. Disclosure should be made to the chief executive or whoever shall determine whether conflict exists is material. So the board in this case is making a decision that yes, there is a conflict, it is material, and it's something we need to bring to somebody's attention. The decision of the board on these matters will rest with their sole discretion, and their concern must be the welfare of the organization and the advancement of its mission. Again, it comes back to that same point. If you're dealing with something and it seems like a conflict of interest and you're going to have to go with it, you want full disclosure, you want to make sure that you can justify to the people in your community and all your key stakeholders that this is a decision we're making in the best interest of our organization. A quick comment on disclosure statements. A disclosure statement has to fully acknowledge the nature of the conflict of interest. That's one part of your disclosure statement. Another part is that you want to make sure you specify that whoever is involved in that recuses themselves from relevant discussions. And recusing oneself means not participating in the discussion or the decision, to simply step away from it all, so that there would be that the person who might interest or might be perceived as personally benefiting is not part of that process. Recusing oneself from the decisions, so that's the other thing. So a disclosure statement, you really want to get at what is the nature of this conflict. Is it serious? Is it something we can avoid? Is it something we have to make sure we pay particular attention to how we're going to share this with the community and be transparent about it? Is the person who's going to benefit from this part of the conversation? No, they've got to be out of that. We have to document that they're out of it, that they should not be part of the decision-making process. And then finally, that's the end. Your questions have been really good. I appreciate getting all of those. As I said earlier, if you'd like more follow-up on any particular question, please feel free to follow up with an email to me. I will absolutely get back to you within 24 hours. You'll be receiving an evaluation, a link to an evaluation form. Please take the time to fill it out and give us your honest feedback. And also, we'll be looking for other ideas around topics that might be helpful to you for future webinar topics as well. The next webinar is scheduled for May 19th, same time, and it's going to be around working with challenging employees, and the one after that's going to be around effective meetings. So I just want you all to kind of be looking for a notification of those, and certainly feel welcome to participate and to spread the word and bring others in as well. And I guess I'll wrap up by thanking you for your participation, and I appreciate your questions. It would have been nice if we could have sat in a room and had more interaction, but we're doing the best we can with the technology we have. And as you notice on the bottom of the page, this is my email address. Please feel free to follow up with any questions or comments. If you'd like some resources, any way I can be helpful, I would be glad to do that. So I thank you again very much, and I thank Reno and Chelsea for your tech support and all this. I couldn't have done without you. And I wish everyone a good afternoon.